Leia Healthcare, looking after you always. Proud sponsors of Real Health with Carl Henry.
Hello and welcome to Real Health with me, Carl Henry, in association with Leia Healthcare. Folks, on this week's episode, we're talking about ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. While we do hear about children getting diagnosed, what about getting a diagnosis as an adult? This week I'm joined by former radio presenter at 2FM, writer and broadcaster Keith Walsh, who was told he had ADHD only this year. Keith, thank you for coming in.
Well, thanks for having me in, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, only told this year?
Yeah. Like
big shock?
49 years of age. I don't know if I describe it as a shock, because it's kind of like there wasn't like a moment where I went like, oh my, like I didn't get a diagnosis and have no clue kind of, do you know the way if you go into a doctor and he's something serious to tell you and you didn't no idea what it was. I suppose I'd been, sort of thinking about it, looking into it, and so there was no kind of shock moment. And maybe it's an ongoing thing because I'm still getting used to it. I'm still trying to figure it out. It's still very much the front of my mind, the front of my brain, which doesn't work properly. And I'm still getting used to things like lifestyle changes, medication, does that work? What's the combination? What changes do I need to make to what I'm doing already, and how do I introduce medication and how does it work? So it's all still very new to me, and I will say at this point I'm no expert. So if anybody's tuning in, hoping to hear an expert, this is literally just my experience so far, and I'm still learning. And as it would be with a person with ADHD, I'm hyper focusing on it at the moment. So I'm reading all the books, but I'm still still very much learning, and it's an ongoing thing even with science and the doctors and psychiatrists. They're still learning as well,
And before we get stuck into the chat, we're going to chat through your childhood and whether you saw signs as a child, but tell people in normal terms what it actually is.
Well, this is the way I understand it. It's first of all, we don't produce as much dopamine as other people, so there's a lack of dopamine there. So we're constantly looking for dopamine. So we're constantly looking for something that will give us that dopamine hit. Now you can get that from exercise. You can get that from, I went through a phase where I was, kind of addicted to exercise, the gym, running, all that kind of stuff. I went so far as I'm actually a trained personal trainer.
I forgot about that.
I went to college.
I remember this years ago when you were on radio. I remember you went to college to do it. That's right. Oh my God. Okay, yeah.
I got so into it, you know what I mean? And that's how we hyper focus. But that's the dopamine thing. So it could be anything like your phone. People have elements of it nowadays, I think, because we're all sort of looking for that dopamine hit, and it's a crazy world, and there's so much, and phones are drawing us in all the time, and we feel that dopamine hit. But with ADHD, it's all the time. So trying to work if you're not interested in the work you're doing, it's a real chore to get something done, something finished, to not procrastinate, to get on with it, to start the job even, So that's a dopamine problem. And then there's an issue with, I'm not really going to know the technical terms, but is it the hippocampus, like the front part of your brain? I think I describe it as like the office. So the front part of my brain is my office, right? So that sort of organizes everything, and then the back part of my brain does all the doing. And there's a disconnect between those two things. So the office isn't connecting with the doing thing, and things aren't getting done. The files aren't being sent properly, or they're corrupt or whatever. And that's kind of how I think of it. And that's probably the best description I can give you.
And looking back now, do you see traits of it as you were growing up?
Yeah, I obviously, so I should tell you, my son got a diagnosis, and that's why I started looking into it, because my wife was like, well, that's you as well. You're the same people. And it was his issues with school that led us to look into it. And when I now, this is all retrospectively, and of course, when I look back at school, I was okay up until a certain age, but I think around 4th class, 5th class, I really just couldn't, I don't know how to describe, couldn't focus, I suppose. I had no interest in what I was learning, the way it was being taught, I suppose. Primary school in the 80s wasn't the most sort of, if you're looking for dopamine, you're not going to get it, with a Christian brother standing at the top of the class telling you about Irish, So I tuned out and I lost interest, and kind of became the class clown then, looking for a buzz. Even if the buzz was getting in trouble, that was better than the boredom of being in class. And that kind of progressed. Like I couldn't really, into first year, second year, third year, probably just got by on, I'm probably clever enough, so I managed to get by, but I just couldn't get my head around study or how that worked. Or there was one teacher I remember, and it stands out to me now, and I can see it, an English teacher, and he was a poet and he was a performer. Like, so he'd come in and he'd perform Merchant of Venice, and we'd get us all standing up and and taking parts and all. And I loved that class, and it really, I really learned in that class. So he taught me Shakespeare, and then we had Huckleberry Finn, I think, was a book we did, and all this kind of stuff. I remember all of the stuff that he taught me because I was getting the dopamine hit in that class. So I looked forward to that class. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being involved. Other classes not so much, and I suppose my reports were could do better, needs to focus, isn't applying himself, is lazy, talkative, messes too much, all that kind of stuff. And these are all things, if anybody is listening who has ADHD or knows someone with ADHD, these are the things that will appear in report cards of a child or an adult who has ADHD. So then I did transition year, which I loved, because it was practical stuff. Like, we did everything from back to doing drama, horticulture, we did photography, we were out and about, we had field trips, we went to the Gaeltacht for a week. So I actually, even my Irish improved. I had no interest in the classroom, but I used to love going to the Gaeltacht. I think I went there 3 years in a row, and I loved learning like that, with people, chatting, all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely signs looking back on it now. And also I should add, and I don't want to hang my sisters, but I was probably quite. I mean, there's an interesting thing about the hyperactivity thing. It's not necessarily, people would say to me, "You seem very calm. You're not hyperactive." It's a hyperactive mind, and it can be physical, and sometimes it can be physical, but sometimes, and with me, it's a hyperactive mind. So I overthink everything. I've got constantly just this, narrative going on all the time, and my mind just goes off on different tangents, and from that tangent goes to a different tangent, and it's just constant, so it's kind of just noisy and annoying. But when I was young, my sisters would have said, genuinely would have said, "You're going to end up in prison." They'd never experienced a bolder child, Now, I was the only boy in the house, but there was definite, I can remember never using, we had these stairs in the house, I never used the stairs. I jumped from the landing down to the, just constantly trying to, I don't know if it's related to the dopamine, but just trying to find getting a buzz off everything. Do you know what I mean? So whether that was getting in trouble or whether that was enjoying something, it was better than just being bored and in my own head, And
what about later in life then? So in terms from a work perspective, and how did it impact on the work that you did?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was always very definite that I didn't want an office job, because, when you're young, you're like, the office job's boring. In actual fact, I probably wouldn't have been able to do an office job. And it was my intuition telling me to do something else. So I went to college, I studied drama, I studied acting, which I enjoyed, which was good for me. It's a practical thing, I'm up and about, it's tactile, it's physical, and that was fine. But after college, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have the tools to kind of put a plan together. I went for 2 auditions, I think, didn't get them. Another thing of ADHD is we're hypersensitive. So I didn't get 2 auditions I went for, so I kind of gave up trying. Even though most actors will go for 100 auditions, and but I just thought, well, this is not for me. I was very sensitive. So when I was rejected twice, I just kind of knocked that on the head. And I probably then, I spent my 20s traveling. I went to London, I traveled a good bit. And if I'm to be honest, I probably self-medicated a lot with whatever to quieten, looking back at it now, to quieten down my mind, and not really knowing that the way I was feeling was different to other people. So, I would have sort of spent a lot of my 20s in a bit of a hazy fog, but managing to travel and see the world, and managing to put money together to go to Australia. Although I would have to say thank you, Suzanne, my wife, who would have been the person who kind of I remember my wife, we were living in London, we planning on traveling. It was a couple of months out. We were due to buy our tickets, and my wife actually marched me up to my bank machine and made me put my card in and said, "How much money do you have in your account?" And I said, "Oh, about £200 or something." You know, I was supposed to be saving money at this stage. And she put the card in. She said, "You don't have £200. You've got like £20." I said, "Yeah, but there's a £200 overdraft." But that was kind of like, I just had no sense of money, planning, the future. And I did want to travel, and I did want to go to Australia. I did want to go with my wife, and I was working, and I was earning money and all that, and paying my rent and all that kind of stuff. But I just had no sense of urgency with it. A thing with me and other people who have ADHD is you'll cram for an exam. You'll do everything in the last minute. You'll be brilliant at it. You know, they're very handy to have in the workplace. Yep. They might be good planners, but when the doo-doo hits the fan, they'll come up with a solution. You know, because they're used to, you know, this kind of stressful. They're always, you know, in that stressful mode. So we did a bit of traveling in my 30s, and I kind of then got into radio, sort of from having done the acting and a bit of writing in college, and I had that, and I enjoyed comedy. So myself and my pal Joe were writing comedy sketches similar to the Fast Show, and stuff we were interested in, and that kind of got us into radio. So in a weird way, like, I ended up, like, radio's great for someone with ADHD. Absolutely, because you're in a studio, there's lights, there's buttons, there's people, there's music.
It flashes, yeah.
Yeah, and you have to kind of like, and it makes you're on the ball. Now, I wasn't great at you know, telling the time during the show, or like what hour it was, you know, so there was little specifics, but I did enough to kind of, I suppose, hold down a radio job. There was a lot of things I needed to do properly to do that for so long, and I figured that out as I went along, as in, like, you've got to be getting your sleep, you've got to be, like, my clothes would be folded and on the kitchen table for me to sort of get into as soon as I walked down the stairs, and I would have to leave at a certain time, and, you know, like, I knew I was late. I was always late, so that had to be dealt with. So I was always, probably, actually the first 5 years I was still late for the radio show, but at one point I kind of fixed that, you know. So all of these things that, you know, could seem like you don't care if you're arriving late for a show that you enjoy doing. It might seem like you don't care about it, but it was just not being able to get your head around organising yourself to actually leave the house at the right time with all the bits you need. And a lot of leaving the house 3 times and all that kind of stuff, or just not getting up on time because you haven't had enough sleep. But I suppose I did radio for 20 years, so, like, the first 5 were a bit kind of helter-skelter, but Joe was a great friend of mine, and we got on very well, and he was very organised, and he kind of probably kept the show on the road, and I just sort of did what I could. But, like, I know at the end of the 5 years, we were on Spin 103 doing the breakfast show. I know at the end of those 5 years, like, looking back on it now, I know what happened, because I just walked away from that. I couldn't really explain to anybody why, but I couldn't do it anymore, because it took so much effort and energy and whatever, because I didn't have everything in my head organised properly. So that show was a bit kind of chaotic for me. And then after 5 years, I just kind of walked away, because I couldn't explain to anybody. I didn't know why I couldn't do it anymore, but I was just done. I was tired, and unfortunately, I walked away from it, you know, which is kind of sad looking back on it now.
Folks, you're listening to Real Health with me, Carl Henry, in association with Leia Healthcare. As ever, you know where we are, realhealth@independent.ie, at Carl Henry PT on Instagram. If you have any questions or requests, do let us know. And don't forget to rate and review. So, Keith, then talk to me about the day then where someone said, you have this. How does that feel?
As I said, like, we'd been dealing with Finn, my son, and organising his school and all that, and the school were brilliant, and, you know, and my wife had started saying to me, kind of, you know, at home, just anything I did, you know, she was like, that's your ADHD. I just became, like, you know, ADHD guy around the house, you know, and so that was kind of like a lot of teasing and fun and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I'd kind of started really thinking about it. I didn't even know my only reference to ADHD, I don't know if you'd probably know more about it because you're in that area. I have
plenty of touches of it. You can ask my own wife and she'll tell you that's our ongoing joke in our house too, right? So
yeah, okay, so there you go. But I remember, I think it was Kurt Cobain talking about his mother giving him Ritalin and giving out about that because of his ADHD, and that was my only kind of reference point. So I didn't really know what it was. So I wasn't like, afraid of anything, but I suppose it's not neurotypical, you know, it's a neurodiverse thing and you're different, you know, so what does that mean? Like, how are you perceived in the world? What will people think of you? Are you, you know, do you have, I don't even want to say what I'm thinking, but like, are people going to look at you differently? Mm-hmm. Are they going to perceive you to be differently? Or like, is your workplace going to look at you and how are they going to be concerned about it? So all those things go on in your head, but I didn't really I wasn't worried about it. I was kind of relieved because it made sense, and I was able to forgive myself for a lot. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I was able to kind of go back, and that wasn't because I'm a bad husband. That wasn't because I'm a bad dad. That wasn't because I'm a bad brother, friend, all that kind of stuff. I was able to sort of forgive myself. There's probably things I did that just, you know, that were just, you know, human and bad and whatever. But for the most part, a lot of my stresses and strains and how I behaved was just kind of like trying to deal with the world and deal with my own head and what was going on. And, you know, that search for dopamine and that search for quiet, you know, it's a weird thing. You're looking for dopamine, but you're looking to quieten your head as well. So it was kind of nice to hear it. It was nice to speak to a psychiatrist who kind of knew exactly. It was almost like talking to a fortune teller. I was like, my mind was blown. And also that he had a plan. He said, look, I figured out what it is, and this is what we're going to do. One of the last things he said to me, my first consultation with him, he said, Keith, you found what you're looking for. And what he meant by that was, because I sat there talking to him for an hour going through all the stuff that I'm talking to you about. Mm-hmm. And I was talking about, he was asking me, I suppose, very pertinent questions, obviously, but I was talking about my constant search for a feeling of calm, and trying to deal with this constant anxiety I felt, which I now have learned is called, I don't know if this is for an ADHD trait, but there's a thing called free-floating anxiety, which you can be very anxious, have a panic attack, and there's no apparent reason for it. Like, you're not in a dangerous situation. You're in a place where you feel comfortable, and it just lands on you because it's just there. It's part of what you're feeling. It's called free-floating anxiety. And I was trying to figure that bit out because, you know, yourself, you work in radio, if you work in television, and you're trying to get television gigs, and but I had this anxiety that I always had to sort of like try and I had to sort of beat. So like in a moment on a radio show, I could have a panic attack, but I'd have to try and appear. Yeah, you're just battling with it, you know. So you can't leave the room. You've got to continue with. You've got to appear like you've got to sound like everything's okay, but in your mind, like there's a panic. Your mind is screaming at you to get out of there, and that can be really unsettling and disconcerting. So I went on this kind of journey, trying to find how I could deal with that anxiety, quieten the mind down, deal with the anxiety. Figure out a way where I could be better focused at my work, and that was everything from the gym stuff. So I thought, look, I think it was around my 40s. I said, that's it. I'm giving up caffeine. I'm going vegan. So I'm giving up all the stuff that's bad for me.
You ran a marathon.
I ran a marathon. Yeah. I think I ran 2 in the end. I was in the gym every day, and I wasn't just in the gym every day. I'd go to the gym. I'd be training for the marathon as well, so there'd be like runs I'd have to do, long runs, you know. I'd have my little chart that I'd have to tick off. And I was also, I think, playing for a hurling team at the time. And like I was on a mission, you know. And Suzanne, my wife, would be like, where are you going? Like, I was constantly going somewhere to play football, 5-a-side. Like anybody, if someone texts...
distraction, it was all, you know, trying to quieten
the mind. But also I was like, the fitter I am, the better I'll be. But I was probably hyper-focusing on it as well, and hyper-focusing on my own feeling and my own health and so much stuff going on. You know, just like ridiculously... I was possibly the fittest man in Ireland at one point, you know. I did fittest family. At some stage with I could have done it on my own. I brought my family. And then I got into then it was about vitamins. So vitamin B was a big thing for me. Like B12, that's the thing. That's the nerve thing, isn't it? So make sure I'm topped up with B12.
Okay, so it's one excess after another, and just listening to you, I think what people will take from it, and certainly myself, is that the mental health component of it, hugely challenging to stay well when dealing with something like that.
Yeah, and that was a big part of it as well, because one of the things I did was I started going to therapy, thinking I need to deal with my childhood traumas. So I started looking into that. So this is where the anxiety has come from. It's a trauma I haven't dealt with. I need to go to therapy, and therapy, in fairness, was really helpful. And I'll always go to therapy. And even if you have ADHD, and even if you get medication, even if a psychiatrist says to you you can still be depressed, you can still feel down. It doesn't fix everything, and you should always. Like I'll go and see my therapist maybe every 6 weeks now, but I'll always check in with him. I'll always try and meditate. I'll always do a bit of journaling. I'll always think about my mental health. But that was a kind of a big thing for me, and it really, really helped. And so here was the thing that happened with therapy. Therapy allowed me to give up drinking. Now, I haven't mentioned drinking, but I would have drank a lot in my 20s. I didn't really drink as much my 30s, 40s, less and less. And then I was a sort of a weekend drinker. But Friday and Saturday, I liked to drink. And I know now it was self-medicating, because I put so much effort into getting through the week. By Friday, 6 o'clock, I'm having a beer. And that was perfectly fine, for me. And it just got me into weekend mode. I could sit down with my wife. I wasn't looking to go anywhere. We could watch a movie. But I had to have drink to do that. Saturdays I could socialise with people, but I had to have drink to socialise, because I'm not a small talk guy. I'm not great in social situations. There always had to be a drink. And I got to a point in therapy where I felt a lot better, and I decided to give up drink, because this was my final thing. So once I give up the drink, I've done everything else. I'm fit. I'm looking at my nutrition. I'm taking the right vitamins. I'm going to therapy. I'm journaling. I'm meditating. Give up the drink. Bang. I'm sorted. A year, 2 years after giving up the drink, I'm still feeling this free-floating anxiety. I'm still getting panic attacks. I wrote a play called Pure Mental. I was on stage 2 nights in. My second night, rehearsals were great, knew the script inside out. Sort of like 10 minutes into my second performance on the second night, I have a panic attack on stage, And in my head, I was I was so upset. So much was going on. Like, you're on a stage, the place was full, all these faces, all these eyes on you. It's the second night. It's this play that you've written about yourself, about mental health, and explaining your mental health, and you're having a panic attack. And in that moment, first of all, I was upset that I was having the panic attack after, this shouldn't be happening. I'm continuing with the work, like one part of my brain is just continuing to perform and walk over here and do the lines and this panic attack just is ongoing, and it's like, get off the stage screaming at me, and I just knew at that point, I said, if I walk off the stage now, I'll never get back on it. And I just had to sort of I'm sure it wasn't my best performance, but I just had to keep going, try and breathe through it, tell myself it was going to be okay, nothing bad was going to happen. And I managed to sort of ride that out, but it meant I was about to start I was leaving Newbridge and I was going around the country, and I had 14 nights to do. So I had 14 nights of a play to do, with this thing in the back of my head, am I going to have a panic attack on stage now? And that was a real fear, So the next 2-3 weeks was spent trying to pinpoint what it was that made me have that panic attack that day. Did I forget to take my vitamins? Did I? It's just so tiring now that I'm talking about it. I'd say it's exhausting to listen to. Do you know what I mean? You're a very patient man.
Well, the story's fascinating. and I would think we'll have lots of listeners who are listening thinking, okay, I can recognise that. Now, myself listening, I can recognise loads of those, because my podcast team will tell you they can recognise loads of them in me too, because they have to put up with me. What would you say to people, and that's my final question for you, people who are listening in, who recognise some of those symptoms, who maybe haven't done anything about it? What do you say to them?
Look, there's no harm in just go and find out about it. Do a bit of research. It can be expensive, but if you talk to a psychiatrist, a lot of them will say, look, you know, you can pay it off monthly or whatever. It doesn't have to be expensive. There is, you can go, I think CAMs are very good for children as well. And you can go public as well. It takes a long time. But in the meantime, you can do your own research. Look into it. I mean, like I only got here to this point because of all those years of searching for something.
Yeah.
And I'm all about trying to better yourself. Now, some people might say, how does that better yourself if you find out you have ADHD? Sure, that's worse. But for me, that's better because I can deal with it. I know where that free-floating anxiety is coming from. I can talk to my psychiatrist. We now have a plan. He's like, this is what we're going to do with this. This is what we're going to do with this. And in a year, you should feel this. And I'm like, I have ADHD. I love a plan. Do you know what I mean? So just look into it. Do a bit of reading. There's loads of podcasts out there. There's a great episode coming up on the Carl Henry podcast.
Podcasts are very popular, to say the least.
So
if people want to kind of find out more about you, the story, and you know, just generally the work that you do, where can they find you? Well,
they can just follow me on Instagram. I'm Keith Walsh on Instagram. I don't know if there's that many. There's a solicitor guy, an Irish solicitor called Keith Walsh. I'm not him.
Okay.
So I'm on Instagram. I'm on social media. You can find me easily, and yeah, just follow me. And I sometimes talk about it. It's difficult, as you know yourself. Even with the mental health, I like to talk about, you know, going to therapy because I think it encourages other people.
Absolutely.
But you don't want to be that guy either, and you don't want to be the therapy guy or the ADHD guy. But I do talk about it sometimes.
The more people talk about stuff, the better, because people listen in and they can get some solace from it, which is fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for coming in. It's been great to catch up. It was a conversation I heard you have with somebody, and I rang Tab. I said we have to have him on. It's really interesting, and I think people will love it. And it's fascinating. So very much appreciated for coming into our studio. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Carl.
Folks, that's it for another episode of Real Health with me, Carl Henry, in association with Leia Healthcare. As ever, you know where we are. Real Health at independent.ie, at Carl Henry PT on Instagram. And we'll see you next week for more Real Health. Slán go fóill.
Leia Healthcare, looking after you always. Proud sponsors of Real Health with Carl Henry.